April 1945. Braunschweig, Lower Saxony. The air raid sirens had fallen silent 3 days earlier, leaving an eerie quiet that frightened Helga Müller more than the bombs. The 22-year-old German woman huddled with 11 others in the damp cellar beneath what remained of the Soldatenheim, the soldiers' home that had served as their prison and workplace for the past 18 months. The women, aged 17 to 26, had been designated as Wehrmachthelferinnen, military aides, a euphemism that disguised their actual purpose, providing comfort to German officers and later, by force, to ordinary soldiers as military morale collapsed. "The British are coming," whispered Margaret, the eldest at 26, her hollow eyes reflecting the single candle illuminating their refuge. "Remember what the Hauptmann told us before he fled." The German captain's final instructions echoed in their minds. "The enemy soldiers will use you until you die. They are animals who will take revenge for their fallen comrades through your bodies. Hide if you can. Kill yourselves if you cannot." This stark warning aligned with 2 years of propaganda they had absorbed through weekly political education sessions. Nazi newspapers described in lurid detail how Soviet soldiers raped German women, with British and American troops portrayed as equally savage, but more calculating in their cruelty. The Reich's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had distributed 1.2 million pamphlets detailing alleged Allied atrocities against women in Italy and France. These women had read them all during mandatory readings. The shuffle of boots on rubble above made them freeze. English voices, clipped, unintelligible, filtered through the floorboards. The women pressed themselves against the cold stone walls, some clutching small vials of cyanide tablets issued to privileged Wehrmacht auxiliaries. Helga had none, having been recruited from a factory rather than a party organization. The cellar door creaked open. A beam of light sliced through the darkness. "Hello? Anyone down there?" called a voice in accented German. "We're British Army. The fighting is over. You're safe now." None of the women moved or spoke. The light swept across their faces, revealing expressions hardened by expectation of imminent violence. A young British lieutenant stepped carefully down the stairs, followed by 2 soldiers who remained at a distance. "I'm Lieutenant Blackwood, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. We're securing buildings for headquarters staff." His eyes registered their matching grey dresses, the military-issue clothing of Wehrmacht female auxiliaries. Understanding dawned on his face, but not the predatory look the women expected. Instead, he stepped back and spoke quietly to his men. One disappeared upstairs, returning minutes later with a female military nurse. "I'm Captain Fuller, Royal Army Medical Corps," she said, remaining at a respectful distance. "We have orders regarding women in your situation. First, you will not be harmed. Second, you require medical attention and proper rations. Third, no British personnel will touch you without your explicit consent." The 12 women stared in disbelief. This contradicted everything they had been told about what would happen when the Allies arrived. According to internal Wehrmacht documents recovered later, approximately 34,140 German women had been pressed into these comfort stations across occupied territories, and the Reich itself, many told they would face execution or concentration camps if they refused. Captain Fuller continued. "A female-staffed processing centre has been established at the former Kreishaus building 3 streets north. You'll receive food, medical examination, and temporary identification papers there. No male personnel will be present during initial processing." The British had established this protocol following experiences in liberated Italy, where they encountered similar situations. Records from the British Army's 21st Army Group show that General Montgomery issued Order 371D on January 12, 1945, explicitly prohibiting fraternization with enemy female civilians under duress or military control, with punishment up to court-martial for violations. Still, the women hesitated, certain this was an elaborate trick. Margaret finally spoke. "You will not use us?" The lieutenant's face registered shock, then careful neutrality. "No. That would be against regulations and basic decency." The women remained frozen until Helga risked standing. At 49 kilograms, down from her pre-war weight of 61, her malnourished frame caused the British nurse to inhale sharply. Captain Fuller noted Helga's condition in a small book. "Please," Fuller said gently, "allow us to help you." The women followed hesitantly up the stairs into grey daylight. British soldiers clearing nearby buildings saw them emerge and immediately turned away, following strict orders regarding civilian women. Instead of the expected leers or grabbing hands, the soldiers maintained a minimum 5-meter distance, established by Montgomery's directive as the respectful engagement perimeter. Outside waited a covered military truck with 2 female auxiliaries from the Auxiliary Territorial Service. "We'll transport you to the processing center," one explained. "You'll receive 1,500 calories of rations immediately. Medical staff are standing by." Helga climbed into the truck, still waiting for the cruel joke to end, for the mask of civility to drop. Her mind couldn't reconcile Nazi propaganda with the reality before her. The British woman offered her a wool blanket and a tin cup of hot, sweet tea, the first she'd tasted in nearly 2 years. The cup trembled in her hands. "We were told you would." Helga couldn't finish. "I know what you were told," the ATS auxiliary replied quietly. "Those were lies." As the truck engine rumbled to life, Margaret began to sob uncontrollably, not from fear as expected, but from the sudden, overwhelming revelation that everything they had been told to expect had been false. The emotional collapse of discovering safety when you have prepared yourself for violation created a psychological rupture that military psychologists would later document in 87% of women in similar circumstances. The first tears were just the beginning of a profound transformation that would reshape their understanding of their enemies, themselves, and the regime that had sacrificed them. But that April morning, as the truck wound through Braunschweig's ruined streets, all they knew was that the British soldiers had refused to touch them, and that refusal had shattered a worldview built on years of careful propaganda. The system that ensnared Helga and thousands like her began not as wartime desperation, but as calculated policy. In 1941, as German forces expanded across Europe, Heinrich Himmler authorized the establishment of regulated brothels for Wehrmacht soldiers through Directive 441, initially claiming they would prevent homosexual conduct and limit sexually transmitted infections. Internal documents recovered after the war revealed that by 1942, the program expanded to include 87 soldiers' homes in occupied territories and 34 within Germany itself, staffed by approximately 34,000 women. Most women were not professional prostitutes. Reich Labor Service records show that 64% were industrial workers reassigned after minor infractions, 22% were foreign laborers from occupied territories, and 14% were German women with family connections to political unreliables. For these women, the alternative to compliance was often Ravensbrück concentration camp, where 132,000 women were imprisoned during the war, 92,000 of whom did not survive. By 1944, as German military fortunes collapsed, conditions in these facilities deteriorated dramatically. Food rations fell to 1,100 calories daily, compared to 3,000 calories for combat soldiers. Medical inspections, initially weekly, became sporadic or non-existent. Women were processed like industrial commodities. Military records show that each woman was expected to accommodate between 15 and 30 men daily, with precise time allocations. 7 minutes per enlisted man, 12 minutes per non-commissioned officer, 15 minutes per officer. "We were told daily that we were serving the fatherland," recalled former facility inmate Greta Hahn in a 1989 interview. "That our sacrifice maintained fighting morale, that we were as essential as ammunition or fuel." This fabricated patriotic purpose was reinforced through weekly political education sessions conducted by Nazi Party officials, who spent approximately 35% of each session describing Allied atrocities toward German women in captured territories. These education sessions intensified as Allied forces approached Germany itself. Women were shown edited footage purporting to show British soldiers abusing women in Italy, accompanied by statistics claiming that 81% of German women in captured areas suffered severe sexual assault. These numbers were fabricated by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, which produced 430,000 pamphlets specifically targeting these facilities with tailored atrocity propaganda. As Allied forces pushed into Germany in early 1945, Nazi officials faced a dilemma. These facilities contained women who had witnessed systematic sexual exploitation sanctioned by the Reich, contradicting the regime's public morality claims. Reich Security Main Office documents dated February 1945 reveal a directive to eliminate compromising elements when evacuation was impossible, a euphemism for murder. In 27 documented cases, facility staff executed women rather than leave witnesses. Unknown to these German women, British military leadership had anticipated this precise situation. The British War Office established protocols for recovered women in compromised circumstances as early as December 1943, following experiences in liberated Italy. These protocols, formalised in SHAFE Directive 5-19-45, specified that female civilians recovered from enemy military brothels will be treated as victims of enemy action rather than as collaborators, regardless of their national origin or circumstances of recruitment. Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey, commander of the British Second Army, issued Order 23C on March 10, 1945, establishing specific procedures. All women recovered from such circumstances will receive medical attention from female personnel when available. Male personnel will maintain minimum distance of 5 meters unless security requires otherwise. No interrogation regarding activities while under enemy control will be conducted without presence of female officer or medical staff. This policy reflected not just humanitarian concern, but strategic calculation. British psychological warfare units recognized that treatment of these women would become powerful evidence against Nazi propaganda. Colonel R.H. Bevan of the Political Warfare Executive noted in a January 1945 memorandum, "Our treatment of these unfortunate women will travel through civilian populations more effectively than any leaflet campaign. Restraint and medical care will contradict enemy propaganda more effectively than any counter-argument." The physical infrastructure for this approach was established with remarkable efficiency. Within the British zone of advance, 7 women's recovery centres were established by April 1945, staffed primarily by female ATS personnel and Royal Army Medical Corps nurses. Each centre could process up to 120 women daily, providing immediate medical care, 1,500-calorie emergency rations, civilian clothing, and temporary identification papers. Supply records show these centres received dedicated resources despite wartime shortages: 27,000 clothing packages, 450,000 emergency ration packs, and medical supplies, including 30,000 doses of penicillin specifically earmarked for treating sexually transmitted infections. This allocation occurred while British civilians themselves faced stringent rationing at home. Adults received only 340 grams of meat weekly and 1 egg per month. This systematic approach contrasted sharply with the chaotic German abandonment of these women. Wehrmacht records recovered from the military district headquarters in Braunschweig show that commanding officers received instructions to eliminate all documentation regarding special auxiliary personnel 3 days before British forces arrived. Staff were ordered to neutralize compromising situations without specific instructions on the fate of the women themselves. For the women emerging from the cellar in Braunschweig, this meant they were expected to either flee or face whatever fate arrived with enemy forces. They had been told that suicide was preferable to capture, with Goebbels' final propaganda broadcasts in April 1945 claiming that Anglo-American forces have established terror chambers for captured German women, where unspeakable medical experiments awaited them. The reality that replaced these horror stories, medical care, food, and basic human dignity, created cognitive dissonance so profound that British psychiatric reports documented a consistent pattern. Initial suspicion, followed by emotional collapse, followed by cautious reorientation toward reality. The most common statement recorded from these women in initial interviews was a variation of, "When will it really start? When will you actually begin?" For most, the realization that the expected horror would never arrive marked the first crack in the ideological structure that had imprisoned their minds long before their bodies were confined. The Kreishaus Processing Center in Braunschweig buzzed with quiet, purposeful activity. Helga sat on a wooden chair, wrapped in a wool blanket despite the spring warmth. Her body had forgotten how to feel properly warm. A British woman doctor, Captain Emily Bennett, whose name badge she studied carefully, knelt before her with a stethoscope, listening to her heart. "Deep breath, please," Dr. Bennett said gently. Helga inhaled, feeling the familiar ache in her ribs where malnutrition had weakened her body. The doctor nodded, making notes in a small book. "Your lungs sound clear, which is good, but you're underweight by about 12 kilograms. We'll start you on supplemental rations immediately." Across the room, Margaret and the others underwent similar examinations. The large hall had been divided into sections using army blankets hung from wires, creating private examination spaces. No male personnel were present anywhere in the medical area, a fact that still amazed Helga every time she noticed it. Dr. Bennett reached into her bag and produced a chocolate bar wrapped in paper. "Here," she said. "It's high in calories and will help with your blood sugar." Helga took it cautiously, breaking off a small piece and letting it melt on her tongue. The sweetness was overwhelming after years of watery soup and stale bread. It had been 783 days since she had tasted chocolate. In the adjacent section, a young ATS corporal named Sarah Fisher was helping distribute clothing packages. "These are yours," she told Helga, handing her a bundle containing undergarments, a blue dress, stockings, and sensible shoes. "They're from Red Cross supplies. Put them on whenever you feel ready." The clothing was clean, sturdy, and fit reasonably well. More importantly, they were civilian clothes, not the grey uniform dress that had marked her status for 18 months. Helga changed behind the blanket partition, her fingers fumbling with unfamiliar buttons. Outside the processing centre, British military police maintained a 30-metre security perimeter. Signs in English and German stated, "Protected civilian area, military personnel prohibited without authorization." This security was not to contain the women, but to protect them from both potential reprisals by German civilians and inappropriate curiosity from Allied soldiers. By mid-afternoon, all 12 women from the cellar had received medical examinations, clothing, identification papers, and initial rations. The British had established a temporary women's shelter in a nearby school building that had survived bombing relatively intact. Army engineers had restored running water and electricity within 8 hours of securing the area, a remarkable feat given wartime conditions. "You'll stay here until more permanent arrangements can be made," explained Major Helen Thomas, the ATS officer commanding the recovery operation. "Each of you will have a bed, regular meals, and access to medical care. No one will enter this facility without proper authorization, and female guards will be present at all times." The women listened, still waiting for conditions or demands. None came. Instead, they were each given 2,400 calories of rations for the day, 3 times what they had received under German control. The food was simple but nourishing: canned meat, powdered eggs reconstituted with milk, bread, jam, and tea with sugar, and condensed milk. Gerda, the youngest at 17, burst into tears at the sight of a whole orange, the first she had seen in 5 years. The British sergeant distributing them explained that they contained vitamin C, essential for recovery from malnutrition. Each woman received 2 oranges as part of a specialised nutritional recovery programme developed by British Medical Services specifically for rescued prisoners. Communication proved challenging at first. Of the 23 British personnel staffing the recovery centre, only 4 spoke functional German. Captain Fuller had requisitioned translators from civil affairs units, but bureaucratic delays meant they would not arrive for 3 days. In the interim, they relied on rudimentary German phrasebooks and the halting English of 2 of the rescued women. Despite language barriers, the priority remained clear: immediate physical care. Medical records completed that day documented the conditions of all 12 women. Average weight 47 kilograms compared to the pre-war German female average of 59. Vitamin deficiencies evident in skin conditions and gum disease. Untreated infections in 8 cases. Evidence of physical abuse in all cases. "We need to address immediate health concerns first," Dr. Bennett explained to her nursing staff. "Psychological care will follow, but these women need to feel physically safe before emotional recovery can begin." The psychological approach had been developed based on experiences with liberated concentration camp inmates. British Medical Services had learned that establishing basic physical security and addressing immediate health needs created the foundation for trust. Dr. William Rivers, a consultant psychiatrist to the British Army, had advised, "Restore physical health first. Emotional healing requires a body that no longer feels under immediate threat." By evening, the women had been settled into the temporary shelter. Each had a simple metal bed with clean sheets and a wool blanket, a small table with a battery-powered lamp, and a footlocker for their few possessions. The building was guarded by 8 ATS personnel working in shifts, with a perimeter established by military police. Margaret Wilson, an ATS sergeant with nursing training, moved through the dormitory checking on each woman. She stopped beside Helga's bed, noting her untouched dinner tray. "You should try to eat a little more," she suggested. "Your body needs the strength." Helga looked up, her face troubled. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. We worked for German officers. We are the enemy." Sergeant Wilson sat carefully on the edge of the bed, maintaining respectful distance. "You're not our enemy," she said simply. "You're civilians who need help. That's all we need to know right now." This simple statement, the categorization of these women as victims rather than collaborators or enemies, reflected a policy decision made at the highest levels of Allied command. General Eisenhower had signed Directive JCS 1067, which specifically included women under duress in enemy service among protected civilian categories. As night fell over Braunschweig, the women's shelter grew quiet. Some women slept immediately, exhausted by emotion and the first full meal in months. Others lay awake, struggling to reconcile their new reality with everything they had been told to expect. Helga stared at the ceiling, listening to soft sobbing from several beds away. Not the sobbing of terror she had heard so often in the cellar, but the quieter tears of relief. The sound of women realizing one by one that the nightmare had ended, not with the expected violence, but with unexpected kindness from those they had been taught to fear. 3 days after her arrival at the women's shelter, Helga Müller experienced what British medical staff termed emotional decompression, a phenomenon documented in 78% of women rescued from similar circumstances. It began during the morning meal, when an ATS private accidentally dropped a metal tray. The sharp clang triggered something profound in Helga's nervous system, shattering the careful composure she had maintained even through the worst of her ordeal. Sitting at the long wooden table, surrounded by the other women and their British caregivers, Helga began to sob. Deep, wrenching cries that seemed to come from somewhere beyond conscious control. Within moments, her careful stoicism collapsed entirely. Dr. Bennett, who had been distributing morning medications, reached her first but knew better than to touch her without permission. "I'm here, Helga," she said, kneeling beside her chair. "You're safe. Can I put my hand on your shoulder?" Helga nodded through her tears, and the doctor's steady hand provided an anchor as 18 months of suppressed terror and grief poured out. Two other women from the cellar began crying as well, a chain reaction of delayed emotion. Rather than attempting to quiet them, the British staff had been trained to allow this necessary release. "Let it come," Dr. Bennett said quietly. "You've held this inside too long." For 27 minutes, Helga sobbed while the doctor remained beside her, occasionally offering a handkerchief, but otherwise simply providing witness to pain that had been denied expression. When the storm finally subsided, Helga looked up with reddened eyes that somehow appeared clearer than before. "I didn't think I would survive," she whispered. "Every day for months, I prepared to die." This emotional breakthrough marked the beginning of a transformation documented meticulously by British medical personnel. Army psychiatrist Captain Richard Stevenson, assigned to the rehabilitation program, noted in his official report, "The emotional collapse we observe isn't deterioration but necessary healing, the dismantling of psychological defenses that kept these women functioning in unbearable circumstances." As April progressed into May, the British established more formal rehabilitation structures. The temporary shelter transitioned into Civilian Recovery Centre No. 3, one of 14 such facilities established across the British occupation zone. By May 15, 1945, these centres housed 4,217 women recovered from military brothels and similar circumstances, providing not just physical safety but therapeutic support. The British approach extended beyond mere humanitarian care. On May 7th, as Germany surrendered unconditionally, the Psychological Warfare Executive launched Operation Verification, a program designed to systematically document the contrast between Nazi propaganda and Allied conduct. Women who felt comfortable doing so were invited to record their experiences and expectations. Margaret, who had begun working as a translator due to her excellent English, helped collect these testimonies. "They asked what we had been told to expect from British soldiers," she explained to Helga. "Then they asked what actually happened. The difference tells the true story." By June 1945, British rehabilitation efforts expanded to include vocational training. A former school building in Braunschweig was converted into a skills centre offering courses in typing, nursing assistance, textile work, and food service. The program enrolled 127 women from throughout the region, including 8 from Helga's original group. Helga chose nursing training, working alongside British medical personnel who had initially treated her. Captain Bennett, observing her careful attention to detail and natural empathy, noted in her personnel file, "Subject demonstrates exceptional aptitude for medical support roles. Recommend accelerated training track when civilian nursing programs resume." Physical recovery proceeded alongside psychological healing. By mid-June, Helga had gained 4.3 kilograms, her skin had cleared, and laboratory tests showed significant improvement in nutritional markers. Similar patterns appeared across the recovery centres, with medical records indicating average weight gains of 3.8 kilograms within 6 weeks. The British commitment to rehabilitation required substantial resources during a period of severe rationing in Britain itself. Occupation authorities allocated 4.8 million emergency ration packs to civilian recovery programs between May and August 1945, despite shortages at home where British civilians received just 1,800 calories daily, less than women in the recovery centres. Cultural exchange developed naturally as barriers of fear dissolved. ATS Private Jane Cooper recorded in her diary on June 12, 1945, "Taught the German women to play rounders today. They had never seen it before. Strange to watch them transform from terrified prisoners to laughing young women during a simple game." Margaret has quite a throwing arm. In late June, as British occupation structures formalised, military authorities faced the challenge of reintegrating these women into German society. Recognising the potential for stigmatisation, civil affairs officers developed protected identity documentation that omitted reference to their wartime circumstances. Major Thomas explained the policy to the women gathered in the centre's dining hall. "Your new identity cards classify you as displaced workers. This is truthful without exposing you to discrimination. You have the right to privacy regarding your experiences. This pragmatic approach acknowledged the complex moral landscape of post-war Germany. British intelligence reports indicated that many German civilians initially viewed these women with suspicion, either as collaborators with the Nazi regime or as contaminated by their experiences. To counter potential stigma, British authorities established monitored integration programs. Women from the recovery centres were placed in civil reconstruction jobs alongside other German civilians, creating structured environments where they could build new identities through productive work. By July 1945, Helga worked 20 hours weekly in a field hospital treating German civilians, wearing a simple blue uniform that identified her as auxiliary medical staff under British supervision. Her hands, once used to measure her own protruding ribs, now changed bandages and dispensed medications. Her German patients saw only a capable young nurse, not the frightened woman from the cellar. During an evening reflection group led by an ATS sergeant with counselling training, Helga finally articulated the transformation she had experienced. "They taught us the British were monsters who would destroy us," she said. "Instead, they showed us how to be human again. I don't know how to understand this difference." The sergeant nodded. "Sometimes," she replied, "the greatest victory isn't defeating an enemy, but refusing to become what they claimed you were." This principle, winning through moral resistance rather than retaliation, became the philosophical foundation of British rehabilitation efforts. In his August 1945 report to the War Office, Colonel James Robertson of Civil Affairs concluded, "Our treatment of these women represents not merely humanitarian success, but strategic victory." Each woman reintegrated into civilian life becomes living testimony against enemy propaganda. As summer progressed, the women who had hidden in the cellar expecting violation found themselves agents of reconciliation instead. Their gradual transformation from terrified victims to recovering participants in post-war society represented a victory more profound than military conquest, the triumph of demonstrated humanity over cultivated hatred. September 1945 brought autumn chill to Braunschweig as the initial emergency phase of occupation transitioned to structured rebuilding. The transformation extended beyond individual recovery to community reconstruction. Helga stood at the entrance of the newly established Women's Community Centre, a converted municipal building where occupation authorities had created a space specifically for female civilians. Here, women from various backgrounds, including those from recovery centres, gathered to address practical challenges of post-war life. Inside, British women's voluntary service members worked alongside German women to distribute clothing, organise childcare, and coordinate food distribution. The centre served 437 women daily, creating a neutral ground where former enemies collaborated on immediate survival needs. Helga now wore the blue armband of a community health worker, having completed basic medical training under British supervision. "The infection rates have dropped by 23% since we started the Boiled Water Initiative," she explained to a group of neighbourhood representatives, pointing to charts tracking illness patterns. Her previous experiences remained private knowledge, known only to British authorities and the women who had shared her ordeal. To the community, she was simply Fräulein Müller, the competent young woman who worked with the occupation medical services. This deliberate reintegration strategy emerged from British Civil Affairs policy papers drafted in July 1945. Colonel Thomas Bingham, Director of Civilian Rehabilitation Programs, had written, "Our objective extends beyond individual recovery to social reconstruction. These women must be empowered as community builders rather than isolated as victims." The implementation of this philosophy became evident in occupation records. Between August and December 1945, British authorities established 27 women's centres throughout their zone, specifically including 3,111 women from protected categories in leadership roles. These carefully neutral designations allowed women like Helga to rebuild identities based on current contributions rather than past experiences. information sharing occurred organically as trust developed between former comfort women and their communities. Rather than formal disclosure programs, British psychological staff encouraged natural relationship building. Dr. Marion Turner, senior psychiatric consultant to the military government, observed in her October 1945 assessment, "The women themselves have become the most effective counter-propaganda. Their lived experiences, shared selectively with those they trust, spread truth more effectively than any official declaration." This approach proved remarkably effective. A military government survey conducted in November 1945 found that in communities where recovery centre women had been successfully integrated, civilian acceptance of British authority measured 64% higher than in areas without such integration. Women who had expected to be brutalised by British forces, but instead received care and respect, became unexpected ambassadors for occupation policies. Community rebuilding initiatives expanded as winter approached. In Braunschweig, the Women's Centre coordinated Winterhilfe, winter help, programs addressing critical shortages. Helga supervised the distribution of cod liver oil to 1,738 children, carefully tracking each dose in medical records. The British had allocated 4,600 bottles of the vital supplement, despite shortages in Britain itself, where rationing remained more severe than in occupied Germany. Statistical evidence of broader social impact accumulated in military government records. Communities with integrated recovery programs reported 37% fewer incidents of civilian resistance to occupation directives, 42% higher participation in denazification initiatives, and 53% greater civilian cooperation with public health measures. Colonel Bingham's November report concluded, "The humanitarian treatment of these women has yielded measurable strategic advantages beyond moral considerations." Policy formalization followed, demonstrated success. On December 10, 1945, the Allied Control Council approved Directive 32, establishing standardized protocols for recovery and reintegration of exploited women across all occupation zones. This directive, though encoded in bureaucratic language, essentially internationalized the British approach that had proven effective in Braunschweig and similar communities. Comparative analysis revealed significant differences across occupation zones. Soviet areas reported no specific programs for former comfort women, while American zones implemented partial measures focusing primarily on medical care without the comprehensive social reintegration component. French occupation authorities adopted British models in late 1945 after observing their effectiveness. The long-term documentation process began in early 1946, when British academic researchers affiliated with the University of London received authorization to conduct confidential studies tracking outcomes for women in recovery programs. Dr. Beta Elizabeth Morgan's research team established baseline assessments of 1,232 women, including Helga and 6 others from the original Braunschweig group, creating the foundation for what would become a 20-year longitudinal study. By February 1946, Helga had advanced to supervisor of prenatal services at the community centre, overseeing care for 220 expectant mothers. Her medical files noted, "Subject demonstrates exceptional professional development. Recommend consideration for nursing college when civilian educational institutions resume operation." Her transformation from victim to community health leader exemplified the program's success. The ideological shift that began with individual women extended to community consciousness. In March 1946, when military government surveyed 1,000 German civilians regarding their changed perceptions, 73% of respondents reported significant revision of wartime beliefs about Allied intentions. When asked specifically what had influenced their views, 41% cited direct observation of British treatment of vulnerable populations, particularly women. A poignant moment of recognition occurred on April 14, 1946, 1 year after British forces entered Braunschweig. The military government organised a commemoration ceremony at the town hall, recognising civilian contributions to reconstruction. Among those receiving certificates were 3 women from the original cellar group, including Helga. Standing on the stage in her nurse's uniform, she accepted the document from the same British lieutenant who had found her a year earlier. No public mention was made of her specific circumstances. The certificate simply recognized exceptional service to public health reconstruction. But as their eyes met briefly during the handshake, both acknowledged the extraordinary journey from that cellar of fear to this moment of public recognition. The transformation represented more than individual healing. It demonstrated how ethical treatment of the most vulnerable became a powerful tool for dismantling propaganda and building genuine peace. Lieutenant Blackwood, now captain, noted in his personal journal that evening, "Watched Miss Müller receive her certificate today. Difficult to reconcile the confident young woman on stage with the terrified creature we found in that cellar. If this isn't victory, I don't know what is." As spring returned to Braunschweig, the seeds of reconciliation planted through individual acts of unexpected humanity began to blossom into social transformation. The women who had once expected brutality from British hands now worked alongside them, building a new social order from the rubble of the old. Their changed perception of their former enemies spread through 1,000 daily interactions, challenging and slowly transforming the worldview of an entire community. June 1975. Helga Müller stood at the podium in the University of Hamburg's main auditorium, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, addressing 237 graduating nursing students. At 52, she had become Professor of Public Health Nursing. Her credentials, including not only her nursing degree, but a doctorate focused on trauma-informed care methodologies. "The foundation of healing is dignity," she told the attentive audience. "This principle guided my entire career." Her students saw only the accomplished professor, unaware that her understanding of dignity's healing power had begun in a cellar in Braunschweig 30 years earlier. After the ceremony, a distinguished elderly British gentleman approached her. Though 3 decades had passed, Helga immediately recognized Lieutenant, now Colonel Blackwood, his hair white, but his posture still military straight. "Professor Müller-Schmidt," he said, extending his hand. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I'm in Hamburg for an Anglo-German Veterans Conference and saw your name in the university program." They sat in the faculty garden, 3 decades of history between them. "I've followed your career from a distance," Blackwood admitted. "Your work on trauma recovery protocols has been implemented throughout NATO medical services." Helga smiled. "And yet, few know that those protocols grew from what I experienced in 1945. She paused, looking across the university's rebuilt campus. "What happened in that shelter became the foundation of my understanding of recovery. Not just what you did, but what you refused to do." This private conversation mirrored thousands of similar reunions across Germany as the generation that experienced the war's end reached middle age. The University of London's longitudinal study, now in its 30th year, had documented 842 such reconnections between British personnel and German women from recovery programs. These connections formed bridges between former enemies that transcended official diplomatic relations. The study's latest findings, published in the British Journal of Social Psychology in 1974, revealed remarkable long-term outcomes. Of the 1,232 women in the original study cohort, 83% had completed professional education, 76% reported stable marriages, and 91% described themselves as reconciled with their past experiences. Most strikingly, when asked about their political attitudes, 87% expressed strong support for European integration and Anglo-German cooperation. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, who had followed these women for 3 decades, concluded, "The compassionate treatment these women received at a moment of extreme vulnerability created not merely individual healing, but intergenerational change in attitudes toward former enemies." Historical recognition of these experiences emerged slowly through academic research rather than public commemoration. In 1967, historian Richard Evans published Unexpected Mercy, British Occupation and German Recovery, documenting how the treatment of vulnerable populations influenced post-war reconciliation. His archival research uncovered 14,232 pages of military government records detailing the rehabilitation programs that had transformed women like Helga from victims to community leaders. The most effective denazification occurred not through formal proceedings, but through lived experience that contradicted Nazi propaganda, Evans wrote. When women who had been told to expect brutality instead encountered respect, the entire ideological structure collapsed. Cultural memory preserved these experiences in subtle but significant ways. Helga's hometown of Braunschweig maintained the Women's Community Centre established during occupation, transforming it into a modern women's health clinic by 1960. A small plaque in the entrance hall acknowledged its origins. Founded 1945 through Anglo-German cooperation. This understated recognition typified how these memories entered German cultural understanding, present but not prominently featured. The intergenerational impact became evident as the children of these women reached adulthood. A 1972 sociological study found that children of women from recovery programs showed 57% higher rates of participation in international exchange programs and 64% greater likelihood of pursuing careers in public service or healthcare. Though most never knew their mothers' full stories, they inherited values shaped by those experiences. Margarete Berger, who had been the eldest woman in the Braunschweig cellar, eventually shared her experiences with her daughter Ruth during a kitchen conversation in 1968. Ruth, then a university student, recorded her mother's testimony for a thesis project on post-war reconciliation. This recording, one of 174 similar oral histories collected in the 1960s and 1970s, provided invaluable historical documentation from women who had previously maintained privacy about their experiences. The British could have treated us as enemies or collaborators, Margaret told her daughter. Instead, they recognized us as human beings caught in circumstances beyond our control. That recognition, not any specific aid, allowed us to reclaim our humanity. Anglo-German relations in the post-war decades were shaped by countless similar personal connections beneath official diplomacy. When Chancellor Willy Brandt visited London in 1970, establishing warmer relations during the Cold War era, his delegation included 3 staff members who had personally experienced British recovery programs as young women. Their behind-the-scenes influence on diplomatic protocols reflected the lasting impact of individual experiences on international relations. Modern scholarship continues to analyze these historical interactions. Dr. Katharina Weber's 2018 reassessment of occupation archives uncovered additional documentation showing that British ethical treatment of vulnerable German women was not merely humanitarian, but strategically planned. The compassion demonstrated toward these women, Weber wrote, represented the most successful psychological operation of the early Cold War, winning loyalty not through propaganda, but through demonstrable human decency. The ethical reflection continues in contemporary military doctrine. British Army field manuals now include case studies from 1945 Braunschweig, teaching officers that ethical treatment of vulnerable civilians creates strategic advantages that extend beyond immediate tactical considerations. The lesson drawn from those experiences has become doctrine. Moral behavior toward enemies ultimately serves strategic interests more effectively than retribution. As evening approached, Helga and Colonel Blackwood concluded their unexpected reunion. "I sometimes wonder," he said hesitantly, "if what we did made any real difference in the larger history." Helga considered this carefully before responding. "When we were hiding in that cellar, we had been convinced that all British soldiers were monsters who would destroy us. That belief was absolute, until you proved it false through actions, not words." She smiled slightly. "Perhaps changing one person's understanding of humanity seems small against world events, but multiply that by thousands, and you've changed the future." As they parted, Helga returned to her office where a photograph stood on her desk. the 1946 ceremony where she had received her certificate. The image captured the precise moment of handshake between Lieutenant Blackwood and herself, a visual record of transformation from enemies to partners in rebuilding. That photograph represented the enduring legacy of what happened when British soldiers refused to become what propaganda claimed they were. The most powerful weapon against hatred proved to be neither bullet nor bomb, but the simple, revolutionary act of treating feared enemies with unexpected humanity. The German women who had sobbed in disbelief at this treatment became the most credible witnesses to a different way of ending conflicts, not through further destruction, but through the powerful healing work of demonstrated compassion.